The Great Depression era was both a financial and an environmental disaster. A 6-year drought that caused dust storms pushed whole populations from the Great Plains to other regions of the country, like California. Now, flash forward to today. We're still feeling the economic effects of the Great Recession of 2008-2009. In the West, parts of the United States are going through a severe drought. Dust bowls haven't returned, but we're already seeing farmers losing money from crops that are money makers, but certainly water hogs, like almond farming, for example. With me on Truthout Interviews to discuss the crisis of the drought and what the government can or could do about it is Sheila D. Collins. She's a professor emerita of William Patterson University in New Jersey and the editor and author with Gertrude Schaffner Goldberg of the book When Government Helped: Learning from the Successes and Failures of the New Deal. She also authored a popular piece on Truthout entitled The West's Coming Tragedy of the Commons. Hello, Sheila. Welcome to Truthout Interviews.
Thank you. Hello, Ted. Nice to be with you.
John Powell figures prominently in your piece on Truthout. Now, some readers may know who he is, others may not. So who was he and why were his ideas about the environment in the Middle West and the West so prescient?
Powell was a Civil War veteran who became a kind of a self-styled geologist and climate expert, one of the very few in that time period in American history, and eventually became the first head of the U.S. Geological Survey. He did an extensive study of the rainfall patterns throughout the western part of the United States. And on the basis of that study, he concluded that the area kind of from the middle of the Rockies west was an arid region that had never and would never have sufficient rainfall to enable it to support agriculture without irrigation. So he wrote this the study that was submitted to Congress. And of course, it was the era of the railroads pushing west and, of course, wanting to reap as much profits as they could, and also the era later on, slightly later on, of the homesteading push into the into the western part of the United States.
So you had these land speculators trying to get people to kind of sell the idea of freedom of the West.
Yeah, to sell cheap land to the exploding population on the East Coast. And of course, many people who were driven out were eager to get a little piece of land. And it was only until the Dust Bowl happened in the 30s that it was really recognized that Powell was right, that part of the country should never have been settled in the way that it was.
And a lot of it was the farming practices of the 1930s, because this was a time when we're seeing mechanized, tractors and really mechanization come to farming. And so what that did is it really changed the landscape, because there was, from what I understand, there was a lot of natural grass that would prevent that topsoil from being blown away from the winds that are apparently common to the plains region. And so when basically these big tractors came in and did some really deep plowing, it was fine as long as the rain came. But once the rain stopped and we had that severe drought in the 30s, well, then it all kind of went to hell.
And apparently the early part of the 20th century was an anomalous period in terms of rainfall patterns. So it had deluded people into thinking that this would go on forever, that they could, sustain that area. And of course, they couldn't.
So we're at a point where, can government do something about it? We saw that John Powell's report to Congress, while prescient, really didn't stop land speculators or the railroads from developing. We've seen FDR, in your article, you talk about how FDR even tried to push through some sort of land regulation and farming practices. Maybe some of those are implemented, but others seem to have died in committee, as it were.
Franklin Roosevelt is a very unrecognized figure for his environmental prescience. We think of Teddy Roosevelt as being the environmental president, but I happen to think that Franklin was a far more astute environmental scientist. And his observations, he traveled throughout that part of the country during the Dust Bowl and saw for himself conditions that people were living in, and the land was ravaging of the land. And he really pushed for a more consonant environmental, ecological vision for the country. His original idea was that, the TVA as a model of regional development based upon the watershed concept, which is similar to Powell's idea, should be replicated across the country in every major watershed area. There should be an integrated development program that the government should play a role in. And his vision was of by that time, a very complex system of jurisdictions depending on local ecological conditions and local social and developmental conditions. But I think his knowledge, his vision has been totally ignored by subsequent presidents and administrations. And I think there's a lot we could learn from it.
We see this kind of push and pull, historically, land speculators, people who have railroad interests, want to push people out to the land. We have a major catastrophe like the Depression. We see dust bowls, and government steps in, and you have somebody of a transformative and a visionary president like FDR coming in and saying, you know what, we really need to use what we know scientifically and our ability as a government to plan for these things not to happen again, to make sure that we don't just sort of run roughshod. And again, we have this pushback that says that your ability to regulate, my interests squashes my liberty. So I won't be able to farm the way I want to. I won't be able to build houses in the middle of a desert and pump tons of water in there. And that's how people should live, And it's this constant narrative or struggle or tension, whatever you want to call it, but it recurs throughout American history, it seems like.
I mean, we're in a very bad situation now with our Congress that doesn't even believe in climate change. I mean, the ones that are, have the power. And federal funding for all of these, for water management, has been grossly cut back. We really need a federal program, and I don't see how we're going to get it with the present political climate.
You want to know how bad does it have to get before the government acts?
It really is scary, because climate scientists tell us we have, perhaps less than 10 years to make the really drastic changes that are needed. And we're not moving at all.
Now, when you wrote your book about the New Deal and about its successes and failures and what we can learn about it, when you think about our current climate, I mean, we have Obama's president, we have a very divided Congress. One house is controlled by the Republicans, the other house is barely controlled by the Democrats. And there's a tremendous amount of gridlock. There's a tremendous amount of fighting. Obama originally came in on the hopes of those who voted for him that he was going to be a transformative president. But he has not been a transformative president. Part of that is that he's been somewhat hampered by the numbers, the way in which Congress is, people voted people into Congress. But if you compare, if it's even fair or possible to compare what Obama is going through, meaning that he inherited this great recession and he's trying to do as much as he can within the power of the presidency, versus FDR, who had a similar crisis that he was dealing with. How do you're looking at the successes and failures. How is it that FDR was much more able to get things done? Was it just the calculus of the Congress back then? The fact that people were hardly using the filibuster as a way to legislate?
Well, that's part of it. But of course, when FDR came into office, the Depression had already been underway for almost 4 years. People were much more desperate. And I think they were much more willing to kind of, and at that time, there was no large federal government. So there was no history of, this pushback against the great beast in Washington, which we have today. So we have a much more, we have a military industrial complex in Washington today that people resent. That's part of it. But also a great part of it is the character of the two presidents, I believe. Roosevelt grew up on the estate in Hyde Park. He was, from a very early age, he was interested in the flora and fauna of the estate and studied it as a scientist would, and kept detailed journals of the flora and fauna of the estate. And he became very concerned about conservation and forest depletion and so forth. So he carried that vision into his presidency. And I believe that the environment, was one of his greatest concerns. The CCC, of course, was one of the earliest programs enacted by Roosevelt. And as I said, his vision of how the country should be developed or should have been developed was far ahead of his time. Also, the fact that Roosevelt himself came from a patrician background and was not afraid to denounce the culprits who had created the Great Depression. And Obama, coming into the Congress as a newcomer, as a political novice, I think also as a man of color who, has to be careful about what he says and does. So they're two very different and distinct personalities, but also distinct times.
We were just talking earlier about climate scientists say we have maybe 10 more years before a serious tipping point happens and things are irreversible. It's like the time is now to have a transformative president. And there's only so much you can do to push our current Congress and president to do things to take this seriously. Yeah. To combat anybody who denies that the climate is changing for the worse in terms of our ability as humans and other life forms to survive this is, quite frankly, just deluding themselves. I mean, it's almost like it's an ideological battle of like, well, it's just perspectives, I mean, my perspective is I don't see your perspective as valid. But it doesn't matter the mounting evidence that you put in front of somebody. They're just going to just sort of wave it away.
I think Obama could have done a lot more. He could, but I don't think he can because he doesn't have the kind of ecological understanding that FDR had to begin with. But he could have, if he had, he could be educating the American public about the crisis, about the nature of climate change, and about what's necessary for us to continue to live on this planet. And I think if FDR were here, that's what he would be doing. He was a great educator. And if you look, my colleague and I who've written the book, look back at his speeches and his fireside chats, and they're just the vision that he had of the nation and what this nation could do and become are really, I think, extraordinary pieces of political rhetoric. And I don't see anything like that in Obama's speeches. They just don't come up to the level of his perspicacity.
The takeaway, if you will, at the end, going through this process, you've written about the New Deal, but you've also written about essentially climate change in a longer term, in a historical perspective, and government's reaction to it. Sometimes they ignore it, like they did with Powell's recommendations, and sometimes they bury it, as what happened with FDR. What do you think we could do going forward? I
mean, there has been obviously a number of interstate compacts to allocate water. For instance, the Colorado River Basin Compact allocates water between the northern and southern parts of the Colorado Basin. However, the allocations were based on that wet period. The compact was written in 1922, and there has been no change since then. So I think the states need to come together to revise and create these new compacts, not only interstate compacts, but also we need intrastate compacts between counties and cities and rural areas. based upon what we now know, will be probably a pattern of future droughts and less rainfall into the future because of climate change. And until that happens, I think we're going to see more and more conflict between states, between agribusiness and municipalities, between environmentalists and the rest of them. The urgency of the times has got to be grasped, and there has to be cooperative agreements.
Agreed. And Sheila, I want to thank you so much for being on Truthout Interviews to talk about your article.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed it.
You can read Sheila's piece on Truthout. It's called The West's Coming Tragedy of the Commons. And that's Truthout Interviews for another week. I'm Ted Asregadoo. We'll see you next time.